You spent your last 100 on that scrap heap?
It's all I had left.
Pathetic. What a joke. A broke single father.
She had absolutely no idea that this broke dad was a master mechanic. And that piece of trash was worth millions.
She laughed at his hunter junker to junker. He's holding a 5-jab chip. The ultimate payback has arrived.
The exhausting, scorching summer heat beat down on the dusty gravel of the local scrapyard as 32-year-old Daniel Evans wiped the thick grease from his forehead. He was a struggling single father working 3 brutal backbreaking jobs just to keep the lights on for his 8-year-old daughter Lily, who clung tightly to his frayed flannel shirt. Daniel only had exactly $100 to his name, saved up penny by penny for a month just to buy a cheap beat-up vehicle, so he could drive Lily to her doctor's appointments without waiting in the freezing rain for the bus. Standing over him with a disgusting look of pure arrogance was Evelyn Vance, the wealthy elitist owner of the town's largest luxury dealership, who had only come to the junkyard to sell off some damaged inventory scrap. Evelyn wore a pristine white designer suit and looked at Daniel and his little daughter like they were an infectious disease. "You actually brought your filthy child to a garbage dump to buy a car," Evelyn laughed, her voice dripping with merciless cruelty as she sipped her expensive iced coffee. "Why do you not just buy her a cardboard box? It would be safer than whatever rust bucket you can afford with that pathetic wad of crumpled singles in your pocket." Daniel felt his jaw tighten with anger, but he swallowed his pride because he could not afford to start a fight. He just needed a win for his little girl. He walked past the laughing millionaire and handed his crumpled $100 bill to the scrapyard owner, pointing at a massive tarp-covered mound of dust and spiderwebs sitting sunk in the mud in the farthest, deadest corner of the lot. The scrapyard owner took the money with a pitying sigh and pulled back the heavy, moldy tarp, revealing an absolutely hideous, dented dirt-covered shell of a vintage sports car. It had no wheels, half the engine was missing, and the once beautiful paint was completely eaten away by 50 years of brutal neglect and rust. Evelyn burst into a hysterical, mocking shriek of laughter, clapping her manicured hands together in pure arrogant delight. "Congratulations, peasant," she mocked loudly, making sure everyone in the yard could hear her humiliating words. "You just spent your entire life savings on a literal piece of garbage. You are not a father, you are a pathetic failure, and your daughter deserves better than a beggar like you." Daniel did not say a single word to the cruel woman. In fact, he did not even look at her. He just knelt down in the mud, gently brushing the thick dirt off the rear bumper of the rusted car, revealing a very faint tarnished metal emblem buried under decades of grime. What Evelyn and the scrapyard owner did not know was that Daniel was not just a broke single dad. He was a former Tier 1 master tactical mechanic for the military, and his trained eyes had just spotted something that made his heart completely stop in his chest. This was not just some random rusty junk car. Buried under half a century of mud was the prototype chassis of a 1966 Le Mans Championship Ford GT48 legendary racing vehicle, long rumored to be completely destroyed in a massive warehouse fire 50 years ago. Daniel had just bought a historical artifact worth more than Evelyn's entire dealership franchise combined, but he kept his head down and stayed absolutely silent, letting the arrogant millionaire laugh her way out of the yard, ignorantly unaware that her entire world was about to be crushed. For the next 5 nights, Daniel Evans barely slept a single hour. He had the massive rusted shell towed to his small, cramped garage, using a favor from an old military buddy. Every night after he put his 8-year-old daughter Lily to sleep, he went out into the freezing garage armed with nothing but a basic wrench set and a can of industrial rust remover. He scrubbed at the decades of thick, hardened grime until his knuckles bled and his fingers went completely numb. He was not trying to fully restore the car, because he did not have the millions of dollars required for that kind of surgery. He was only trying to uncover the buried truth. On the 3rd night, his wire brush finally broke through a thick layer of baked-on grease on the driver's side firewall, revealing a small stamped rectangle of tarnished steel. Daniel shined his cracked flashlight on the metal, and his breath caught in his throat as he read the hand punch VIN number 1046. It was not just a replica, and it was not a salvage. It was the exact legendary car driven by the racing gods themselves, thought to be turned to ash half a century ago. Meanwhile, across town in her sparkling multi-million-dollar dealership, Evelyn Vance was busy recording a live video for her thousands of followers arrogantly bragging about her new shipment of imported Italian sports cars. She even laughed on camera about the pathetic broke loser she saw at the scrapyard, joking that poor people should be banned from driving altogether because they ruin the aesthetic of the road. Her wealthy elitist followers filled the comments with merciless laughter validating her cruel ego. But Daniel did not care about her stupid internet video. On the fifth morning, he took crisp, clear, close-up photographs of firewall VIN number, the unique prototype chassis welds, and the faint original blue and orange paint still hiding under the wheel wells. He sent those 5 photographs in a single email to the headquarters of the most exclusive historical automotive auction house in the world, along with a message to forward the images directly to billionaire racing legend Richard Sterling. Daniel knew that Sterling had spent the last 40 years and tens of millions of dollars desperately searching the globe for this exact missing car. Daniel hit send on the email and sat back in his cheap broken garage chair, wiping the grease from his hands, knowing that the match had just been struck and the entire world was about to explode. The very next morning at exactly 6 a.m., the heavy oak doors of Richard Sterling's billion-dollar private estate flew open with a deafening crash. The 70-year-old billionaire racing legend was not wearing his usual tailored suit. He was sprinting down the marble hallway in his pajamas, clutching a glowing digital tablet in his trembling hands. For 40 years, Sterling had hired private investigators, spent millions in bounties, and chased thousands of dead-end rumors across the globe, trying to find the holy grail of automotive history. And now in his inbox were 5 high-definition photographs from a broke single father in a dirt-poor town. "Scramble the jet right now," Sterling roared at his panicking chief of staff, his voice cracking with overwhelming emotion as tears of absolute disbelief welled in his eyes. "I do not care about the board meeting. Cancel everything. We are flying out immediately. And bring the blank platinum checkbook." Meanwhile, back in the small, cramped town, Evelyn Vance was sitting in her luxury dealership office, sipping imported champagne and refreshing her viral social media video. The cruel clip of her humiliating Daniel at the scrapyard had just crossed 2 million views, and her wealthy elitist followers were mercilessly mocking the broke mechanic in the comments. She laughed arrogantly, believing her cruelty was just untouchable entertainment. She had absolutely no idea that at that exact second, a massive matte black Gulfstream private jet was tearing to the clouds at Mach speed, heading directly toward her small, pathetic town. Daniel Evans was cooking cheap pancakes for his 8-year-old daughter Lily when the ground outside his tiny apartment suddenly began to shake. He looked out the kitchen window and saw 3 massive armored black SUVs pulling up directly onto his cracked driveway, completely surrounding his cheap, beat-up garage. 4 heavily armed private security guards stepped out, forming a tactical perimeter as the rear door of the lead SUV opened. Out stepped Richard Sterling, the racing god himself, wearing a sharp bespoke suit, his eyes locked dead on the closed garage door like a man who was about to meet his maker. The billionaire did not knock. He just stood in the freezing driveway in complete reverent silence, waiting for the master mechanic to appear. Daniel wiped his hands on a dish towel, kissed Lily on the forehead, and walked out his front door to face the powerful man who was about to change his daughter's life forever. The freezing wind whipped across the cracked driveway as Richard Sterling, the billionaire racing legend, walked slowly toward Daniel Evans. Sterling did not look at the cheap peeling paint on the apartment building or the worn-out flannel shirt Daniel was wearing. He only looked into the mechanic's calm, steady eyes. "Show it to me," Sterling whispered, his deep, gravelly voice shaking with decades of unfulfilled desperation. Daniel nodded silently and pushed open the creaking wooden door of his tiny, cramped garage. The 4 heavily armed private security guards secured the perimeter as Sterling stepped into the dimly lit space. Sitting in the center of the oil-stained floor was a rusted dirt-covered shell of the 1966 Le Mans prototype. Sterling dropped to his knees on the cold concrete, completely ignoring his bespoke $1,000 suit. He reached out with trembling, arthritic hands, tracing the tarnished metal of the chassis welds and gently brushing the reveal VIN number 1046. Tears streamed freely down the old racer's face as he buried his forehead against the rusty hood of the vehicle he had spent 40 years desperately hunting. "It is real," Sterling wept openly, the heavy weight of a lifetime completed finally lifting from his shoulders. "You found her, son. You found the lost ghost." Daniel stood quietly holding his 8-year-old daughter Lily's hand, knowing exactly how much this machine meant to the man on the floor. Sterling slowly stood up, wiping the tears from his wrinkled cheeks before reaching into his tailored jacket and pulling out a solid platinum checkbook. I know exactly what it is worth, and I am not going to insult a master Tier 1 mechanic. By haggling over scrap prices, Sterling said, his voice hardening with absolute respect. He clicked a heavy gold pen and quickly wrote out a number that made Daniel's heart stop dead in his chest. Sterling handed the slip of paper over the rusted roof of the prototype. $5 million tax-free and cleared directly into your account this afternoon, Sterling stated firmly. Daniel stared at the ink, completely paralyzed, as Lily looked up at him, innocently unaware that her entire medical future and college tuition had just been permanently secured. But I am not finished yet, Sterling continued, his eyes narrowing with a fierce predatory gleam. I do not just want the car. I want the brilliant man who rescued it. I want you to be the chief engineer of my private restoration syndicate with a 7-figure starting salary. Daniel looked at the billionaire and then down at his callous, grease-stained hands, finally realizing that his days of begging for scraps were over forever. We have a deal, Mr. Sterling, Daniel rasped, shaking the legend's hand. Good, Sterling smiled grimly. Now get dressed, because we are going for a ride to a certain local luxury dealership, and we are going to show the arrogant little girl who really owns the road. The massive fleet of armored matte black SUVs roared through the quiet streets of the small town, heading directly toward the gleaming glass showroom of Evelyn Van Cest's luxury dealership. Inside the opulent office, Evelyn was busy filing her nails and sipping more imported champagne when her panicking sales manager burst through mahogany doors. Mr. Richard Sterling is pulling into our lot right now. The manager screamed, his face pale with shock. Evelyn dropped her champagne glass onto the Persian rug, her eyes widening in pure dollar-sign-driven ecstasy. The billionaire racing legend was the most powerful automotive titan in the world, and if he was buying from her dealership, she would be crowned the untouchable queen of the industry. Fix your ties and roll out the red carpet immediately, Evelyn shrieked, frantically fixing her designer suit and sprinting out to the showroom floor. The heavy dealership doors slid open, and Richard Sterling walked in, flanked by his massive, heavily armed private security team. Evelyn rushed forward with a sickeningly sweet fake smile plastered across her arrogant face. Mr. Sterling, it is an absolute honor to welcome you to my humble showroom. I have the finest Italian imports ready for your inspection, she purred, pathetically bowing her head. Sterling did not even blink at her. He stopped dead in the center of the showroom and crossed his arms, his piercing eyes boring directly into her cowardly soul. I did not come here to look at your mass-produced, overpriced trash, Evelyn, Sterling rasped, his gravelly voice echoing off the high glass ceilings like a death knell. I came here to introduce you to my new partner and the chief engineer of my global restoration empire. The heavy security guard stepped aside, revealing Daniel Evans walking slowly into the showroom. Daniel was no longer wearing his grease-stained flannel. He was dressed in a sharp tailored suit bought directly from Sterling's personal tailor, and he held his little daughter Lily's hand. Evelyn Van Cest's jaw dropped so hard it nearly shattered on the pristine tile floor as she stared in absolute paralyzing horror at the broke loser she had just humiliated on a viral video a few days ago. Evelyn's face drained of all color until she looked like a terrified ghost as she stared at the handsome, well-dressed man standing in her showroom. You are the peasant from the scrapyard, she whispered pathetically, her legs shaking so violently she almost collapsed in her expensive heels. Richard Sterling stepped forward, his presence commanding the entire room like an angry titan. The man you disrespected and called a failure has more genius in his bare hands than you have in your entire miserable life, Sterling roared, his voice shaking the expensive Italian sports cars surrounding them. That rust bucket you laughed, it was a lost 1966 Le Mans prototype, and I just paid him $5 million in cold hard cash for it. Evelyn let out a sickening choke as the absolute crushing weight of her colossal stupidity slammed into her mind. She had literally stood in the mud in front of a $5 million historical artifact, and instead of buying it herself, she chose to make a cruel internet joke. But I am not just here to gloat, Sterling continued, pulling out his glowing digital tablet. I saw that disgusting viral video you posted mocking a struggling father in front of his innocent child. You clearly forgot that I personally sit on the global board of directors for every single luxury manufacturer that supplies your pathetic dealership. Evelyn fell directly to her knees on the pristine tile floor, weeping openly as Sterling tapped a single button on his screen. I just revoked every single one of your distribution licenses, Sterling stated coldly, putting the tablet away. Your dealership is officially dead, and no automotive brand on the entire planet will ever sell you another vehicle as long as I am breathing. Evelyn Vance kneeled on the cold tile floor, weeping uncontrollably as the crushing reality of her instant bankruptcy finally destroyed her arrogant mind. Please, Mr. Sterling, you cannot do this to me. I built this dealership from nothing. I can apologize to him. I will do anything, she begged pathetically, her expensive mascara running down her pale, terrified face in thick, ugly black streaks. Daniel Evans looked down at the broken millionaire, but there was absolutely no pity in his calm, steady eyes because he remembered exactly how cruelly she looked at his little daughter in that freezing scrapyard. You did not build anything, Evelyn. You just inherited wealth and used it to step on people who were already drowning. Daniel said, his deep voice quiet, but absolutely lethal. Before Evelyn could even scream out another pathetic, cowardly apology, the deafening roar of a dozen heavy diesel engines shook the showroom windows. She looked out the glass doors in paralyzing horror as a massive fleet of heavy-duty commercial tow trucks began pulling to the dealership gates. They were driven by the manufacturer's elite repossession teams sent directly by Richard Sterling's exclusive emergency orders. Dozens of men in gray coveralls swarmed the lot, completely ignoring Evelyn's hysterical screams as they began hitching up every single $1 million Italian sports car on her property and dragging them away. This is illegal. You cannot take my inventory, she shrieked, crawling toward the door, but Sterling's heavily armed private security guards blocked her path like impenetrable stone walls. They do not belong to you anymore, little girl, Sterling rasped, coldly crossing his arms as he watched her entire arrogant empire get hoisted onto flatbeds in a matter of seconds. I bought your entire outstanding debt portfolio on the flight over here, which means I legally own this building and everything in it, and you have exactly 5 minutes to pack your trash and get off my property. Evelyn Vance frantically gathered her expensive designer purse and a few pathetic trinkets from her mahogany desk, while Sterling's massive, heavily armed security guards watched her every single desperate move. She stumbled out of the heavy glass doors of her now completely empty showroom, her expensive heels clicking hollowly on the tile as she wept. She ran frantically toward her personal custom Range Rover parked in a reserved VIP spot, desperately trying to unlock the doors so she could escape the absolute waking nightmare. But massive, grimy tow truck driver was already winching the rear axle off the ground, completely ignoring her hysterical screams. That vehicle was purchased under the dealership corporate account. Lady the tow truck driver grunted, chewing on a toothpick as he locked the heavy steel chains. Which means it officially belongs to Mr. Sterling now. So I suggest you start walking before I tow you down the highway along with it. Evelyn stood in the freezing parking lot, completely penniless and shattered, watching her entire arrogant life get dragged away down the street until there was nothing left but empty asphalt. Daniel Evans stepped out of the dealership holding his little daughter's hand and looked at the massive empty glass showroom with a calm, satisfied grin. What do you want to do with this gigantic empty building, son? Sterling asked, lighting a high-end Cuban cigar as he watched Evelyn pathetically stumble down the cold sidewalk in her ruined designer suit. Daniel looked down at his callous mechanic hands and then up at the gleaming architecture. I think this town needs a free tactical mechanical training center for struggling veterans and single parents, Daniel replied, his deep voice echoing with absolute honor and purpose. Sterling laughed, a booming, joyous sound that warmed the freezing air. Consider it fully funded, my friend, Sterling bellowed, slapping Daniel proudly on the back as they walked toward the waiting armored SUVs, leaving the arrogant millionaire to freeze in the exact same mud she once mocked him in. 6 months later, the bitter cold winter had melted into a warm golden spring, and the lives of everyone involved had been permanently and drastically altered beyond recognition. Evelyn Vance was now working the late-night shift at a disgusting, greasy fast food drive through barely making minimum wage and constantly hiding her face in utter shame whenever her former wealthy elitist friends pulled up in their luxury cars to order cheap burgers. But miles away from her miserable reality, deep inside the highly classified underground restoration vault of Richard Sterling's private billion-dollar estate, Daniel Evans was standing exactly where he was always destined to be. The massive hangar was filled with tens of millions of dollars worth of cutting-edge robotic fabricators' titanium tools, and a hand-picked squadron of the greatest military and civilian engineers on the entire planet who all answered directly to Daniel. Sitting in the dead center of the pristine white epoxy floor mounted on a surgical rotisserie lift was a once rusted junk shell of the 1966 Le Mans prototype, but it was no longer a piece of garbage. Under Daniel's tireless, brilliant leadership, the chassis had been surgically sandblasted, reinforced, and treated with aerospace-grade sealant. They had sourced the original highly classified blueprints and were currently rebuilding the massive 7-liter racing engine completely by hand, bolt by perfect bolt. Daniel wiped a small speck of grease from his chin, grinning with pure unstoppable joy as he watched his 7-figure restoration syndicate bring the historical ghost back to life. Sitting safely in a custom-built luxury observation deck just above the hangar floor was 8-year-old Lily, playing happily with high-end educational toys, her medical bills permanently paid, and her future completely secured. Richard Sterling walked onto the hangar floor holding 2 cups of expensive coffee, handing one to Daniel, as they both looked up at the glittering exhaust pipes of the mechanical beast. "It is almost ready to breathe again, is it not, son?" Sterling asked, his eyes shining with overwhelming pride. Daniel just nodded, tightening a titanium bolt with his scarred, callous hand, and smiled, knowing that tomorrow they were going to wake the dead. The massive hangar doors slowly opened to reveal a perfectly clear, crisp spring morning as Daniel Evans climbed into the driver's seat of the fully restored 1966 Le Mans prototype. It was no longer a rusted, forgotten shell. It was a flawless, glittering masterpiece of automotive history, with perfect original blue and orange racing stripes and a completely rebuilt 7-liter engine. Richard Sterling sat proudly in the passenger seat, wearing his vintage racing goggles and a massive, joyous grin. Daniel pressed a heavy titanium ignition switch, and the massive engine exploded to life with a deafening primal roar that shook the entire estate. They drove the priceless $5 million artifact out of the vault and down the scenic highway, the engine howling like a resurrected beast. As they cruised through Daniel's old hometown, they rolled past a disgusting, greasy fast food drive-thru. Standing at the trash cans in a stained uniform was Evelyn Vance, carrying bags of garbage, her face covered in sweat and misery. Daniel dropped a gear and slammed the accelerator, sending a deafening shockwave of pure horsepower echoing through the street as the gorgeous prototype blurred past her. Evelyn dropped her trash bags in the dirt, her eyes widening in absolute shadow recognition as she realized the glittering masterpiece flying past her was the exact same rust bucket she had mocked in the scrapyard. Daniel did not even look in the rear view mirror. He just shifted into high gear and accelerated toward the horizon, knowing that he had secured his innocent daughter's future forever, and he was never looking back. The massive hangar doors slowly opened to reveal a perfectly clear, crisp spring morning as Daniel Evans climbed into the driver's seat of the fully restored 1966 Le Mans prototype. It was no longer a rusted, forgotten shell. It was a flawless, glittering masterpiece of automotive history, with perfect original blue and orange racing stripes and a completely rebuilt 7-liter engine. Richard Sterling sat proudly in the passenger seat, wearing his vintage racing goggles and a massive, joyous grin. Daniel pressed a heavy titanium ignition switch, and the massive engine exploded to life with a deafening primal roar that shook the entire estate. They drove the priceless $5 million artifact out of the vault and down the scenic highway, the engine howling like a resurrected beast. As they cruised through Daniel's old hometown, they rolled past a disgusting, greasy fast food drive-thru. Standing at the trash cans in a stained uniform was Evelyn Vance, carrying bags of garbage, her face covered in sweat and misery. Daniel dropped a gear and slammed the accelerator, sending a deafening shockwave of pure horsepower echoing through the street as the gorgeous prototype blurred past her. Evelyn dropped her trash bags in the dirt, her eyes widening in absolute shadow recognition as she realized the glittering masterpiece flying past her was the exact same rust bucket she had mocked in the scrapyard. Daniel did not even look in the rear view mirror. He just shifted into high gear and accelerated toward the horizon, knowing that he had secured his innocent daughter's future forever.
True honor is
and he was
always
never
hidden
looking
in the
back.
shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Subscribe to Honor Hidden now.